Spring returned without ceremony. The fields, once vivid with corn and memory, now lay fallow under a sky that had forgotten how to shine. The fence that bordered the property, once sturdy, white, proud, had collapsed in places, its boards giving in to rot and wind. Weeds grew thick and high along the edges, curling like accusations, whispering where no voices remained. The father didn't fix the fence. He told himself it wasn't worth the time. But really, he had grown used to things falling apart. The house, the radio, the Buick, the family, none of them had broken all at once. They had crumbled quietly, as if trying not to wake him. He took to walking the edge of the property in the evenings, cigarette in hand, boots soft with wear. Sometimes he talked aloud, to himself, to the boy, to God. But the words no longer carried weight. They scattered like ash, fading before they reached the trees. He hadn't heard from the boy in nearly a year. The last message had come in the form of a social media post. Someone else had shown him a photo of the man now, hair bleached silver, draped in a mesh shirt, smiling under a banner that read, "Queer Futures Collective." The father had stared at the photo for a long time. The smile was real, the joy uncontainable. But it wasn't a joy he shared. It was joy built elsewhere, for someone else, against something he had unknowingly stood for. There were moments when he almost called, late nights, when the quiet stung worse than insult. But what would he say? "Come home. I miss you." Words felt like currency in a world that no longer accepted his tender. Every attempt would be weighed, decoded, challenged, and he had grown too tired for debates, disguised as conversations. He found himself watching the mailbox as if expecting something to arrive that would never be mailed. He fixed the porch light even though no one came by. He left the guest room clean. Then, one evening in June, he found an envelope on the kitchen table, no name. Just a date and a place, a community gallery opening in the city, 2 counties away. He wasn't sure how it got there, no note, no message. Only that single gesture, an invitation. He drove out early, wore his cleanest shirt, the one he used to wear to church. The gallery was bright, pulsing with music and voices and bodies in motion. He felt like a statue in a tide. No one noticed him until he saw it. A canvas, large and unframed. A tree, tall, twisted, blooming in impossible colors. Its branches stretched into spirals. Its roots bled into sky. And at the base, carved gently in the paint, "My father's silence was the soil. I grew anyway." He stared at it. For a long time, his eyes did not water, his hands did not tremble. He simply stood, letting the weight settle. The boy, his boy, had found a way to speak, even if it was without him. He didn't try to find the artist, didn't ask for the signature. He left the gallery and drove home under a sky, slowly reclaiming its stars. Back at the house, he sat on the porch, lit another cigarette, and watched the wind push through the weeds where the fence used to be. He didn't cry, he didn't pray, he just sat there, listening. And he whispered into the dusk, "What if the love I offered was never the love you needed?" The wind gave no answer, only the quiet rustle of things that grow in the dark. The father sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, years later, with a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands. The room was dimly lit by the overhanging bulb that flickered every now and then. Like it, too, struggled to stay consistent. There were dishes in the sink, mail unopened on the counter. Time had made itself at home. It had been another phone call, brief, efficient. The boy, now the man, now more idea than presence, had called to say he wouldn't be coming this year. No specific reason, just too much going on. The father said he understood, even though he didn't, said, "Take care," even though something inside him wilted with each goodbye. He didn't feel anger. He would have welcomed anger. Anger has heat, texture. What he felt was dissolution, a slow, spreading numbness. His son, his only child, had drifted so far away that even his absence felt abstract. It was like mourning someone whose body hadn't died, only their name. He reached for the photo album, flipping through pages yellowed with time. There was the boy on his first day of school, clutching a lunchbox, smiling as if the world had whispered secrets only he could hear. Another of him, at 12, holding a drawing, a rough sketch of a tree with a heart-shaped canopy. The father had laughed at it then, not cruelly but dismissively. "Trees don't grow like that," he'd said. Now he stared at that drawing longer than he'd ever stared at any of his own tools or harvests. The heart-shaped tree. What was he trying to say back then? That love was not linear, that beauty could defy shape, that truth lived in strange forms. He closed the book and went to the mirror above the fireplace. It was old, inherited, speckled with time. The silver had begun to peel at the edges, distorting his reflection. He stared into it anyway. He saw himself, and he didn't. His face looked carved more than grown, etched with seasons of silence, of trying to be right rather than whole. And behind him, in that mirror's haze, he thought he could almost see the boy too young, then older, then vanishing into smoke. What unnerved him most wasn't that his son was gay. He had made peace with that years ago. It was that he couldn't seem to speak to him without stepping on a landmine. The man his son had become believed in a kind of constant revolution, an eternal purging of the past, and the father, he was the past. He remembered the conversation they'd had one winter, over coffee at a roadside diner. The boy had said, "You don't get it. You never will. That's not your fault, but it is your problem." He had nodded then, pretending to absorb it, but inside, something had broken that could not be glued back. Not because the words were cruel, but because they were so final. There was no room in them for his voice, only for his listening. He had always tried to listen. He really had. But he came from a world where listening meant fixing, where problems were solved, not dissected, where emotion wasn't language, just noise to be weathered. And now he was being told that his silence was violence, that his kindness wasn't enough, that his very existence bore guilt he hadn't chosen. So he stopped trying to speak. Not out of surrender, out of mercy, because he didn't want to say the wrong thing. Again, he walked to the garage, where the Buick still waited, its body rusting softly like a thing remembering how to die. He ran his hand over the hood, then turned on the radio, just static now. He left it on anyway, and he spoke into the silence to no one, to everyone. "I never wanted to be your enemy. I just wanted to be your father." Then he sat, cigarette lit, eyes closed, the mirror of his heart stripped of silver, and he asked the dark, "Is there a kind of love that still matters when you're no longer allowed to give it?" Time has a way of turning soft edges to splinters. After the boy, no, the man had left again, the house filled with a different kind of silence, not the peaceful hush of solitude, but the alert, humming stillness of absence, a room left in a rush. A question never answered. He never said he was cutting ties. He never announced a boundary. He simply visited less, called less, sent postcards instead of stories. The postcards arrived from cities that buzzed like neon signs in the father's mind. Berlin, Portland, Tel Aviv, places where sidewalks swelled with causes, where rainbow-painted crosswalks marked territory the father didn't recognize. Each card was a dispatch from a country he hadn't entered, written in a dialect he barely understood. Queer Film Festival, Trans Rights March, Mutual Aid pop-up, even the stamps looked like protest art. The man in those cards was lit up. Electric. He wrote in fierce italics, described joy as resistance and love as revolution. But it felt performative, curated, like he was trying to prove something to the world, maybe to himself. And yet, to the father, every line sounded like a rebuke. When the boy did come back, Thanksgiving, maybe Christmas, he brought someone new, not a girlfriend, not even a boyfriend. A partner, Ray, or maybe Ray, with a soft voice and sharper eyes. Ray wore a shirt that read "Decolonize everything," and corrected the father for calling the waitress ma'am. The father tried to smile, tried to laugh it off. He said partner, like he'd practiced it. He didn't flinch when they held hands across the stuffing, but something in him recoiled, quietly. Not in disgust, in displacement. He was no longer on familiar ground. The holidays became trials in restraint. Conversations tiptoed through politics, identity, structures. Ray talked about erasing binaries. The boy said tradition was a trap. Later that night, the father escaped to the garage again, turned on the old radio. The station he used to listen to was gone, replaced by static and hollow ads. He sat in the darkness, with a whiskey glass and a box of Christmas lights he didn't bother to hang. He smoked again. Another trespass, another comfort. The next morning, the boy found him there. They stood in silence for a long while. "You still keeping this thing alive?" the boy asked, nodding at the Buick. "Trying to," the father said. "You could just let it die, Dad. Let it rest." And that was it. A metaphor too pointed to ignore. The boy wasn't talking about the car. He was talking about everything. The house, the history, the fatherhood that had tried so hard to do right by him, but still fell short. The father didn't answer. He couldn't. He just turned and looked at the rope swing one more time, sagging, soft with age. He used to think time would fix things, that the years would smooth over the roughness, like water carving stone, but the years had changed the boy, not brought him closer. They had hardened his voice, sharpened his edges. The softness was gone. The wonder had calcified into judgment. The boy had once asked if stars got tired. Now he spoke as if the universe was something to dismantle. He remembered a time when he'd been the hero, when a scraped knee needed his touch, when his approval mattered. Now, he was the ghost at the feast. Not hated, just unnecessary. The boy left the next day without hugging him, just a nod. Ray squeezed his shoulder gently. The father managed a tight smile. After they left, he walked the house, slowly, touched the wall with the growth marks still scrawled in pencil, ran his hand over the doorframe the boy used to lean on while talking about dreams. He sat on the edge of the unmade guest bed and breathed the leftover scent of some cologne he didn't recognize. He turned on the TV, and some show about queer history came on. He didn't change the channel, just watched. Not out of interest, but out of penance, as if bearing witness could somehow bridge the gap. But no bridge came. Only commercials. Only static. Only the sound of wind whispering through the trees like voices lost in another room. And he wondered, again and again, can love survive when it's no longer allowed to speak its own name? There was no thunderclap, no gasped revelation. The moment passed like smoke over still water. One ordinary night, at a kitchen table stained by time and roast drippings, the boy, now a young man, angular and composed, lifted his fork, took a breath, and said, "I'm gay, Dad. Always have been." That was all. Not defiant, not fearful, just matter of fact, like saying the sky had been blue all along, and only now had the father looked up. The father blinked, reached for his water glass, missed it. His hand trembled slightly, but he didn't let the glass fall. He set it down slowly, carefully, like it might explode if handled wrong. The steak on his plate, perfectly seared and salted, had already gone cold. He looked at the boy, his boy, and said nothing. Not because he didn't care, not because he was angry, but because he felt the ground shift. Subtly, like discovering a hairline crack in the foundation that stretched in both directions. The boy kept talking, about Ray, or maybe Ray, about queer theory, about chosen family and visibility in safe spaces. Each word was like a train station announced through fog, recognized in name, but not in spirit. The father nodded. He smiled. He told himself he was being supportive. He told himself he was being brave. But inside, something was collapsing. Not out of malice, not even disappointment, just loss. A vague, hollow ache that couldn't be filled by understanding. Because it wasn't just who the boy loved, it was what he had come to believe. What he now stood for, and what he seemed to be standing against. There was no invitation to understand, only a declaration, handed down like a verdict. The father wasn't being asked to know, he was being told to adjust. He excused himself politely, took the dishes to the sink, ran water too hot over his hands. He watched the steam rise and tried not to hear the boy still talking, still explaining terms, trauma, structures, systems. Later that night, alone in the garage, he sat on the hood of the old Buick and stared at the rafters. They still had the old rope swing up there from when the boy was 8. back when he'd worn superhero capes and told knock-knock jokes, back when he asked questions like, do stars get tired and can animals be sad? He lit a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in years, but something about the weight of that silence, about knowing he would never again be the father of that 8-year-old boy, made the taste worth the shame. It wasn't about the gayness. That, strangely, was easy. It made sense, in hindsight. The softness, the poetry, the pain. He could accept it. He could say, I love you, and mean it. But love had become complicated. Love now demanded new language, new rituals. Love now arrived with disclaimers, trigger warnings, and post-colonial analysis. The boy had returned not to be embraced, but to educate, and the father, whose love had been practical, physical, proven by deeds and presence, was told that wasn't enough. He listened, patiently. He tried. He bought books. He watched documentaries. He practiced new pronouns. He said partner instead of boyfriend. He did the work, or tried to, but it never seemed to count. There was always more. Another layer, another failure, another reminder that his generation was blind, harmful, in need of unlearning. He was not a father, but a project, not loved, but tolerated, not home, but history. And so, as the night deepened and the wind stirred through the trees, the father sat in the garage, staring at the rope swing. He thought about cutting it down, about preserving it, about swinging from it one last time. He whispered into the dark, not knowing if the boy would ever hear, I would have loved you no matter what. I just didn't know how to prove it in your language. And he wondered, as the garage filled with smoke and memory, what kind of truth needs to erase its roots in order to bloom? The house was simple, built of pine and patched memory. Its floors creaked in the winter and moaned in the summer. And somewhere inside that sighing rhythm, the boy had learned to grow. It wasn't a place of violence or neglect. The father was no monster, only a man with a quiet blueprint of how things ought to be. That blueprint was born of his own father, and his father's father before him, etched deep into the marrow, not out of cruelty but certainty. He had raised his son with care. There were rules, yes, but they were fences to keep out chaos, not cages. He taught him to tie knots, to bait a hook, to wipe his boots before entering the house. He praised him when he earned it, scolded him when it mattered, and left space in between for the boy to become whoever he might be, or so he thought. What he didn't know, what he would later come to suspect, was that the boy felt that space like a void, not an opening. He felt unseen in that very effort to be unseen. The father didn't press into the boy's feelings, because he had never learned how. When his own father died, he'd cried in the barn alone and buried the tears like grain. To share pain was to loosen the bolts that held the world together. And yet, the boy needed something else. He needed a language that did not exist inside that pine house. He needed mirrors, not to reflect obedience or discipline, but to echo back his strangeness as beauty. Instead, he was met with decency, routine, and a smile that said, "You're doing fine," even when he felt like he was drowning. He remembers one night clearly. The boy had painted his bedroom sky blue and stuck glowing stars across the ceiling. He had played a song on repeat, some ethereal chorus of voices, neither sad nor joyful, just otherworldly. The father knocked softly, entered, and sat on the edge of the bed. "This music makes me feel like I'm floating," the boy said, looking up at his artificial sky. The father smiled, trying. "It's nice, peaceful." The boy nodded but didn't smile. "You don't hear what I hear." And he hadn't. He heard notes. Maybe. Melody. But not whatever mystery his son had woven between those tones. Still, he didn't argue, just ruffled the boy's hair and said, "Good night, Star Traveler." It became a joke between them for a while, Star Traveler, a term of endearment that lingered on birthday cards and under breath. But like most things between them, it faded before it could root. As the boy aged, the house seemed to shrink around him. He stopped painting, stopped playing music. He started to speak less and observe more, not out of wisdom, but from distance. The kind of silence that comes when your language is missing from every book on the shelf. The father noticed, of course, but what tools did he have? He bought the boy books. He offered practical advice. He said, "I'm proud of you when the grades were high, and I know you'll do better when they weren't." And when the boy cried quietly after school, claiming it was nothing, the father made soup instead of asking more. But the house had no corners, no shadows to hide in, secrets to share. It was too honest, too plain. It didn't know how to make room for identities not yet named. The father had grown up in a world of known things: crops, cattle, seasons. The boy was growing into something unclassifiable, something that bent around tradition like light around a black hole. He began to draw lines in the air with his fingers, sketching shapes no one else could see. He spoke of injustice in classrooms, of kindness as rebellion. He used the word queer long before he used the word gay. The father heard that word with a strange chill. It didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like an announcement, a manifesto. And then came the questions about gender, about colonialism, about the very soil they stood on. The boy was not merely stepping away from his father. He was questioning the ground his father stood on. They had a fight once, the kind that hangs in the walls for years after. It wasn't about being gay. It was about a comment, something the father said, unthinking, about boys being boys. The boy exploded, said he felt irate, said he was tired of living in a house where silence was called peace. "I gave you everything," the father said. "I needed something else," the boy replied. They didn't speak for a week after that, and even when they did, something had changed. The boy's door stayed closed more often. The house, once too open, now felt like a series of locked rooms. The corners had returned, but they no longer offered safety, only separation. And so, the father sat one morning, with his coffee cooling in hand, staring at the wall of family photos. The boy's image stared back, younger, rounder, eyes full of questions. And he whispered aloud, to no one, "What kind of man am I if I raised a son who can't come home? What do you do with a house that remembers what you don't dare revisit?" The wind moved gently through the dandelions, bending them in sweeping unison across the field behind the old farmhouse. Each stalk, a memory. Each puffed white crown, a silent breath held too long. He sat there, the father, hands leathery from work, a crumpled Stetson, shielding his eyes from a son he no longer cared to greet. He could still hear the boy's laughter in the wind, high and shrill, back when he was small and oblivious to disappointment. But the laughter had gone brittle. Something else lived in its place now, a kind of political fury, adorned with pastel flags and sharpened hashtags. There was no single moment when the break happened. It wasn't a door slammed or a voice raised. It was slower, more insidious, like a creeping vine taking root in the rafters of a house. Unnoticed, until the beams began to groan. The boy had always been different, not in any damning way, just tuned to a frequency the father couldn't quite hear. He'd laugh at things that made no sense, cry at things that didn't warrant it. The father chalked it up to sensitivity, maybe even brilliance. There was pride, certainly, even as he struggled to understand. But understanding wasn't what the boy needed. Not really. He needed affirmation, reflection. He needed the father to see him not as a seedling growing toward a known shape, but as something unpredictable, wild and strange. That expectation, unspoken, inherited, became the very fence he rebelled against. Years passed like freight trains, heavy, loud, and not to be stopped. The boy went from drawing unicorns in the margins of his homework to disappearing behind a closed bedroom door. Headphones on, body moving to rhythms the father couldn't follow. He saw the signs. Yes, he knew, but he also hoped, not that his son would change, but that he would stay near, that whatever shape he grew into would include the old man who once carried him on his shoulders through the county fair. Instead, he watched as the boy built a new vocabulary, a new identity, piece by piece, online and elsewhere, far from the red clay and shotgun sunsets of home. He started to speak in a tongue that left no room for middle ground. Everything was either liberation or oppression. Silence was violence. Tradition, a curse. The father listened, nodded, tried to keep up, but each word felt like a brick in the wall growing between them. It wasn't the gayness. That word, once heavy with taboo, felt light compared to the enormity of what came after. It was the ideology, a creed of endless correction and self-definition, a moral clarity so blinding it refused to see the man who had built the foundation beneath his son's feet. The boy, now a man, wielded his beliefs like a sword, slicing through nuance, history, and affection alike. There were no more fishing trips, no more shared jokes over football games. The last time they hugged, the father felt the stiffness in his son's back, like he was enduring an obligation. The warmth had gone out of it. What remained was performance, a duty to appearances. He had become a relic, a problematic artifact to be tolerated at holidays, if at all. The field was quiet now, save for the wind and the distant hum of cicadas. He picked a dandelion, rolled its stem between his fingers, and remembered teaching the boy how to make a wish with its seeds. "Blow hard," he'd said. "Blow like you believe in something." Back then the boy had closed his eyes tight, cheeks puffed, and scattered those seeds into the air like spells. Now, the father wondered what he had made him believe in. What dream had been planted too deep, too poisoned by his own blind hope? He had wanted the boy to be strong, kind, free, but not like this. Not at the cost of everything they had shared. Not so estranged he couldn't recognize the man he'd become. He put the dandelion down, watched it roll in the wind. Thought of the boy in some city apartment surrounded by people who spoke the same language he could never learn. And he felt something break, not a violent snap, but a slow crumble, like earth returning to dust. He had raised a son who now believed the world had to be remade. But in that remaking, the father had been left behind. Not condemned, not punished, just erased. What do you do when the future you've nurtured no longer needs you? When it doesn't even recognize your face?